Good morning. My name is Taylor Bachrach. I'm the NDP Member of Parliament for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, and I'm joined today by Alexandre Boulerice, the Member of Parliament for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie, and Alex Cool-Fergus with the Canadian Climate Action Network. And today, as COP28 kicks off in Dubai, we are once again reiterating our call on the Environment Minister to release as soon as possible his government's framework for an oil and gas emissions cap. We know that the oil and gas industry in Canada continues to increase its emissions during a climate emergency, and the much promised and long-awaited emissions cap framework has been delayed. There are a lot of questions about what will be in that framework, and we're urging the minister to release it as soon as possible. Not only to release the framework, but to follow that up with the regulations that are so important to ensure that the oil and gas industry is held to account and required to do its share and not sit on the bench in the fight of our lives against global climate change. We're looking for a few things in that framework. I mentioned that it's important that the oil and gas industry is required to do its part. We've heard from the Environment Commissioner that this government's climate plans are falling short, that Canada is not on track to meet its 2030 target, and that's largely because emissions from the oil and gas sector continue to rise. In the discussion paper on the emissions cap framework that the government released, we know that they're considering two options, a cap and trade framework and a pricing approach. We feel that this cap needs to be a hard cap, and if companies are allowed to simply buy their way out of reducing emissions, that does not reflect what Canadians expect. It doesn't reflect what we expect as a party, and it's not going to get us to the target in 2030 that this government has committed to. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Alexandre.
Merci, Taylor. Bonjour tout le monde. Alors oui, effectivement, on est au début de cette COP28 qui se déroule à Dubaï et le gouvernement libéral et M. Guilbeault arrivent à Dubaï les mains vides. Alors que les libéraux nous avaient promis à Glasgow en 2021 qu'il y aurait un plafond des émissions du secteur pétrolier et gazier, 2 ans plus tard, on n'a toujours rien. Alors c'est une farce. Le Canada est un cancre. On arrive à Dubaï avec nos partenaires internationaux, puis on n'a rien à leur proposer. Ça fait 2 ans que les libéraux ont fait cette promesse-là et ils ne le livrent toujours pas la marchandise. Alors qu'il y a absolument urgence. Monsieur Guilbeault, la planète est en feu, littéralement. Les glaciers fondent. On a une crise de la biodiversité et vous arrivez à Dubaï avec rien du tout, avec une délégation canadienne pleine de lobbyistes du secteur pétrolier puis gazier. C'est pas sérieux. Monsieur Guilbeault, réveillez-vous. Il est temps d'agir. Votre bilan est absolument désastreux. Vous avez joué un gouvernement qui a acheté un pipeline Trans Mountain qui nous coûte plus de 20 milliards de dollars. Vous avez autorisé Baie du Nord. Vous signez des permis d'exploration près de Terre-Neuve pour de l'exploitation gazière et pétrolière. Et le commissaire à l'environnement, pas plus tard qu'il y a 2 semaines, vient de dire qu'encore une fois, votre gouvernement va rater toutes les cibles de réduction de gaz à effet de serre. On mérite mieux, les Québécois méritent mieux, les Montréalais méritent mieux, puis surtout les générations futures méritent mieux. Parce que si le Canada n'est pas un pays immensément peuplé, par habitant, on est parmi les pires au monde. Et votre gouvernement, sérieusement, fait rien pour régler le problème. Alors, réveillez-vous, bougez. Il y a beaucoup de choses à faire, entre autres sur l'électricité propre, entre autres sur le plafond pour les émissions de gaz à effet de serre pour le secteur pétrolier et gazier. Vous n'avez toujours pas agi sur ce plan-là. La COP est une bonne occasion de le faire, mais il va falloir être sérieux, M. Guilbeault. Il va falloir être sérieux parce qu'on ne veut pas avoir un plafond qui ressemble à un fromage gruyère. On ne veut pas des exemptions, puis on ne veut pas des échappatoires, puis on ne veut pas des compensations financières. Alors j'espère que vous allez être sérieux, puis vous allez envoyer rapidement dans le processus réglementaire un vrai plafond strict et ferme des émissions de GES pour le secteur pétrolier et gazier. Merci.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci beaucoup. J'étais ici la semaine passée avec le Parti vert, le Bloc québécois, pour dire sensiblement la même chose que le NPD aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire que c'est le moment pour le gouvernement de montrer qu'il est sérieux en matière d'ambition climatique et d'imposer un plafonnement strict et ambitieux sur le secteur pétrolier et gazier. Les Canadiens ont attendu extrêmement longtemps. La société civile attend depuis des années de l'action climatique pour prouver que le gouvernement est sérieux en matière d'ambition climatique. C'est le moment et nous attendons avec impatience non seulement non seulement que le cadre soit publié, mais également que le plafonnement lui-même soit mis en œuvre, parce que les Canadiens ne peuvent plus attendre. Ce n'est pas le moment de consulter davantage avec l'industrie, avec l'Alberta, qui ont montré à maintes reprises que ce sont des mauvais joueurs. C'est le moment d'imposer le plafonnement. I'm going to say this in English. My name is Alex Cool-Fergus. I'm with Climate Action Network. Last week, I was in this very room with the Bloc Québécois, with the Green Party, saying similar things as I am saying today, which is that we need the federal government to get serious about imposing an oil and gas cap on the emissions from the oil and gas sector. Canadians have waited for much too long for this really crucial piece of Canada's climate policy to be implemented, and we cannot wait any longer. The government must, A, release the framework with an ambitious cap, and they must also be serious about getting this framework through the regulatory process. There's no time to lose. This cap has to be imposed on the oil and gas sector as soon as possible if Canada wants to have any chance of meeting our emissions targets for 2030 and for 2050 as well. So I really appreciate the NDP's leadership on this really important issue. As civil society, we are going to continue working with anybody who wants to advance ambitious climate action. And that's why I'm standing here today with colleagues from the NDP. Thank you.
Okay, any questions?
Mr. Guilbeault has said already that the emissions cap is likely to be announced during COP28. I was curious if there's anything else that the NDP are looking for. What would make this conference a success for your party?
Well, when it comes to the emissions cap, the proof is in the pudding. We want to see what is in the framework, what approach the minister is taking, and how much he is going to require the oil and gas industry to reduce its emissions. We know what the entire economy is going to be required to do in order to meet the 2030 target. The government has modeled out the least cost pathway in the emissions reduction plan. And I think if Mr. Guilbeault announces an emissions cap that is anything less than what is articulated in the emissions reduction plan when it comes to the contribution of the oil and gas sector, he's going to have to explain that to Canadians.
But there's no new international agreements or pledges that you're holding your breath for from maybe a global point of view? Nothing.
Well, I think the meta issue at COP28, the issue that people are preoccupied with, is the role of oil and gas in driving catastrophic climate change. We had a report just last week from the International Energy Agency indicating that globally the oil and gas industry has to reduce emissions by 60% in order for us to avoid the most devastating consequences of runaway climate change. Obviously, there are big concerns about the fact that COP28 is being held in Dubai and that the chair of the conference is using this opportunity to make oil and gas deals. That's something that everyone should be concerned about, as well as the fact that the conference for the past number of years has been crawling with oil and gas lobbyists. That's why it's so important that elected officials and civil society are there to hold governments to account, including our own government. Do you want to add anything on that, Alex?
That's perfect answer.
David.
Yeah. So you said, Taylor, that basically what the government is contemplating right now is either imposing a more stringent price on the oil and gas sector or a cap-and-trade system. So has the NDP taken a position on which they'd prefer to see?
Well, I think if most Canadians hear the word cap, they hear an emissions cap, what they hear that to mean is that emissions won't be allowed to go above a certain level. And so the cap and trade approach is a cap within which companies are able to trade credits in order to achieve that cap. A pricing approach would allow companies to essentially buy their way out of reducing emissions. Of course, you know, if the price is high enough, it's going to make the reduction of emissions more feasible for those companies economically. But what we're looking for here is a hard cap without any loopholes. And we know when we're talking about the Liberal government, there are a few things that seem to crop up again and again. One is delays. The second is loopholes. And we know why that is. It's because the oil and gas industry's lobbyists meet with this government hundreds and hundreds of times. And so we're going to be looking very carefully at the framework that is released to ensure that it meets the moment that we're in, that it addresses the urgency of the times that we're living in, and that it requires Canada's most polluting industry to reduce its emissions by the amount that's required.
So are you prepared to say today that you would not support a pricing mechanism?
What we're looking for is a hard cap on emissions that doesn't have loopholes. And the hard cap needs to be defined as a percentage reduction above which companies are not able to pollute. And so that's what we're going to be looking for in the framework. We're going to be holding Minister Guilbeault to account. That's what the government has promised, is a cap. And so a cap is a cap is a cap. If a cap with loopholes that allow companies to buy their way out of meeting the cap, that's not a cap.
So just to be clear, because I don't want to write a headline that says the NDP is proposing the cap and trade system for the oil price. Like, are you proposing that? Like, is that what you want to see?
What we want to see is a hard cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. In the discussion paper that the government released, there were two pathways that it discussed. In our view, the cap and trade pathway is the only pathway that involves a cap. And so we're going to be looking for a hard cap without loopholes so that Canada can meet its 2030 target and do what's required to address this issue that's affecting future generations and present generations for that matter.
So would it be accurate to say that the NDP is calling for the oil and gas cap and they're calling for it to be imposed for the cap and trade system?
We're calling for a hard cap, and within that hard cap, how the government chooses to structure the regulations so that companies are able to meet that cap remains to be seen. What we're looking for, though, is the stringency that's required at this moment in time to ensure that the oil and gas industry in Canada is doing its share.
So can that be achieved by like a strict price on carbon that is more than $65 a ton? You know, can that be achieved? Do you think that it can be achieved by like a strict or higher price on carbon?
Well, it really depends. But if companies are able to essentially buy their way out of reducing emissions, that is not a cap.
Can I switch gears for a second? Where does the NDP stand on carbon capture? The federal government recently doubled down on the technology in the fall economic statement. It's pretty controversial. Environmentalists think it's unproven and tantamount to industry greenwashing. Where do you guys stand on it?
Yeah, I think this technology is largely unproven at scale. There may be a role for carbon capture and storage for certain high emissions industries, but it shouldn't be used to continue business as normal, to continue with the status quo. That's the message that we heard from the International Energy Agency, and that's certainly the position that we're taking. What we need is real reductions in emissions. We need to rapidly ramp up the development of renewable energy in this country, and we need to ensure that we're creating sustainable jobs for the people who work in the energy industry. That's why Bill C-50, which is currently being filibustered at the Natural Resources Committee, is so important that we get that passed, because it lays out a framework that puts workers at the table and that ensures that in the transition, the families, the hardworking families across Canada that rely on these jobs have a say in how the transition takes place, so that we're creating well-paid jobs in the energy sector, we're building renewables as quickly as possible, and we're driving down emissions right across the economy.
J'ai une question pour M. Boulerice. Juste peut-être par rapport à la COP28 et vos attentes pour le gouvernement canadien. Je sais que j'ai manqué le début, mais en termes peut-être d'un plafond d'émissions, qu'est-ce que vous aimeriez voir du gouvernement Trudeau?
Just a quick follow-up on the previous question in English. You know, for us, it's carbon capture is much more wishful thinking. It's the famous conservative technical magic wand that Pierre Poilievre will put in your face for the next 2 years, maybe or a year, and it's not proven, it's not working. You know, renewable energy is the future of job creation, good jobs, and sustainable economy. Oui. Madame Martin.
Pour la COP28,
oui.
Le gouvernement, M. Guilbeault est sur place. On parle beaucoup de plafond d'émissions. Qu'est-ce que vous aimeriez voir concrètement d'annoncer de la part du gouvernement Trudeau?
Bien, déjà, on est très déçus aujourd'hui que le gouvernement Trudeau, avec M. Guilbeault, entre dans cette COP 28 les mains vides. On nous avait promis à Glasgow un plafond d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre pour le secteur pétrolier et gazier, qui est quand même le secteur qui pollue le plus au Canada. Puis là, 2 ans plus tard, rien du tout. Semble-t-il qu'il y a des rumeurs que ça va être annoncé dans les prochains jours. On verra. Mais pourquoi ils se sont traînés les pieds pendant 2 ans alors qu'on aurait paru beaucoup plus sérieux sur la scène internationale avec une proposition claire et nette. Bon, et ensuite de ça, il va falloir voir si jamais il dépose quelque chose ou il présente quelque chose, est-ce que ça va ressembler à un fromage gruyère? Est-ce qu'il va y avoir des échappatoires, des exemptions? Est-ce que les compagnies vont pouvoir acheter des compensations financières pour éviter ce plafond-là? On veut quelque chose de ferme, on veut quelque chose de sérieux, puis on veut un processus réglementaire qui va être enclenché rapidement. Parce qu'un cadre, c'est bien beau, mais si le processus réglementaire il commence à être discuté puis mis en place dans 5 mois, dans 6 mois, dans 8 mois, on perd du temps alors qu'il y a urgence, puis le Canada rate toutes ses cibles de réduction de gaz à effet de serre sous la direction de M. Guilbeault.
Est-ce que vous avez un chiffre en tête pour le plafond? Vous, qu'est-ce qui serait un plafond en termes de cible?
Bien, c'est sûr qu'on regarde la cible actuelle du gouvernement libéral, qui est des réductions globales de 40 à 45 Pour le plafond comme tel, le chiffre qu'on a eu pour l'instant, c'est 31 %. Il faut vraiment être plus ambitieux que ça, parce que la responsabilité du Canada sur la scène internationale elle est plus lourde, vu que chacun de nos concitoyens pollue beaucoup plus que quelqu'un qui vit dans un pays en voie de développement, un pays plus pauvre également. Alors, c'est pas juste en prorata de la population, mais c'est aussi en prorata de notre responsabilité collective sur la planète, sur la pollution et les émissions que nous avons. Donc, on espère que le gouvernement va être plus ambitieux. Mais moi, j'ai toujours dit, c'est bien beau se fixer des cibles plus ambitieuses, mais si ensuite de ça, on a des décisions qui sont contradictoires, puis qu'on a un commissaire de l'environnement qui nous dit, à chaque année, on rate nos cibles, ça ne veut pas dire grand-chose. C'est un peu un coup de publicité pour avoir un joli titre dans un article, mais si après ça, tu autorises Baie du Nord et des permis d'exploration gazière et pétrolière au large de Terre-Neuve, ça veut dire que tu fais une chose pour son contraire. Alors, on veut des cibles plus ambitieuses, mais on veut surtout un plan d'action qui est réaliste puis qui est urgent.
Moi, j'ai juste une dernière question par rapport à Bombardier. Autre
Oui.
sujet, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de cette décision du gouvernement Trudeau d'attribuer le contrat sans appel d'offres à Boeing pour ses avions?
C'est extrêmement décevant parce que on a plusieurs compagnies, Bombardier entre autres, qui développent cette capacité de bâtir des avions de surveillance qui vont être des avions de surveillance, dans le cas de Bombardier, de nouvelle génération, avec une nouvelle technologie, probablement qui vont avoir une espérance de vie beaucoup plus grande. Et là, sans aucune raison apparente, le gouvernement fédéral donne un contrat directement à Boeing, sans avoir la possibilité pour les autres compagnies de s'exprimer, de déposer leurs projets puis d'être évalués. Moi, je pense que c'est pas de la bonne gestion des fonds publics. Puis je pense que c'est aussi c'est risqué parce qu'on va acheter un avion d'une ancienne technologie qui va arriver à terme très, très bientôt, le P-8 de Boeing. Alors, je ne comprends pas cette décision-là. C'est pas la meilleure gestion des fonds publics. C'est pas transparent, c'est pas ouvert. Puis en plus de ça, ça brime une compagnie québécoise. Alors, il faut que les libéraux s'expliquent là-dessus.
Can I just come back to a couple questions about cap for Madam Cool-Fergus and also the NDP? I'll start with the NDP. The government has said that there must be enough room in a cap for production to grow. Does the NDP feel the same way? Would you be comfortable with the government setting a cap that allows room for increased production as well, but not increased emissions?
Yeah, this is about accountability, and it's about emissions. And so if the industry is able to find a way to increase production within a hard cap on emissions, that's one thing. But what we're talking about is a hard cap on emissions and accountability to the climate commitments that this government has made. But if we look globally, increasing fossil fuel production is not a climate plan. We know that largely what's responsible for global climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. And so we need to move as quickly as possible to renewable energy. We need to reduce emissions from the most polluting sector in our country.
I mean, very similarly, this is about emissions, and we were talking about emissions, and we were talking about the emissions cap. And it's very clear to everyone that the Canadian government is not constitutionally allowed to impose a production limit on the oil and gas industry. And so we're not asking the government to do that within this framework. And within this cap, we are really hoping that the government can impose a stringent cap on emissions, because that's absolutely what is needed. But if we do look at, the IEA's estimates, even the Canadian Energy Regulator's estimates, there is no scenario really where there is sustained growth of or of demand for oil and gas over time, right? And everyone who's serious expects that oil and gas demand is going to peak sometime this decade. So, you know, obviously we're really focused on the emissions at this point with this cap, and we are encouraging the government to be serious about reducing the emissions from Canada's most, you know, emissions-intensive industry.
Am I to take away from your comments, Taylor and Alexandre, that the cap needs to be at a minimum 191 megatons, because that's what the ERP says, the modeling the ERP shows?
Well, as I mentioned, the modeling in the ERP is the least cost pathway for meeting the government's target. And so if the government is going to choose to let the industry contribute less than what's articulated in that emissions reduction plan, I think they have to explain to Canadians and explain to other sectors of our economy why they're going to be expected to do more while the oil and gas sector is expected to do less. You know, the emissions reduction plan commits to a 40 to 45% reduction in emissions across the economy. Already, the least cost pathway has the oil and gas industry reducing emissions by less than that,
So
based on 2005 levels.
what should be the total emissions we should see from the oil and gas sector in 2030 with this cap in place?
Well, we're calling on the government to ensure that the oil and gas industry is doing its share, and I think if they're going to require the industry to reduce emissions by less than what's articulated in the least cost pathway, they're going to have some explaining to do with Canadians. The least cost pathway, to my recollection, is 31% of 2005 levels, 42% of 2019 levels.
Can I ask one more just about the Environment Committee and Laurie Pusher's testimony earlier this week? There are calls from the Alberta NDP to review the Alberta Energy Regulator. I'm wondering what level of faith you have in the AER after listening to Mr. Pusher's testimony.
Yeah, I was at the committee meeting yesterday, as were you, and it was pretty disturbing to hear what's happened at the Curl site in Alberta. Talking to the First Nation downstream, they've been expressing concerns ever since the very beginning that their water is being polluted by these tailings ponds. And then looking at the timeline and looking at the lack of timely action by both the company and the energy regulator raises a huge number of questions. Communities deserve better, Canadians deserve better, and we need to ensure that there's a proper regulatory regime in place, both provincially and federally, to ensure that these tailings ponds aren't leaching toxic chemicals into the environment, into the river.
So you would support that call for a review of the AER then?
Oh, I think that's the least that should be done, absolutely.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks so much.